Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Wolf& Company's webinar on the topic of preparing for HITRUST certification. My name is Stephanie Creedon. I'm a member of the marketing group at Wolf & Company, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. During today's presentation, members from Hayes MD Audit and Wolf & Company will be discussing how HITRUST CSF has become one of the premier security frameworks in North America, and will explain how to understand the HITRUST scoring rubric, MyCSF, and the policy for procedural requirements for the 19 HITRUST domains. They'll detail how organizations should prepare for and execute the HITRUST certification process. Plus, we'll be hearing from Paul Henderson, the lead solutions architect at Hayes MD Audit, who completed a HITRUST validated audit with Wolf & Company. But before we get started, I'd just like to go over some housekeeping items. The presentation will be recorded and available after the conclusion of today's webinar. All attendees will receive a copy of the presentations to the links in the recording in a follow-up email. Please feel free to pass along to any colleagues that may find this webinar valuable. The format of the webinar will be structured as a Zoom webinar, so all attendees will be muted throughout the presentation. If you would like to submit a question, please do so by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom control panel. Please refrain from using the chat and direct all your questions through the Q&A channel. And the presentation will be about 1 hour. We will allow for plenty of time at the end to answer any questions. It's now my pleasure to introduce our presenters today, Mike Canarellis, he's a principal at Wolf & Company, and Paul Henderson, the lead solutions architect at Hayes MD Audit. So thank you both for presenting and sharing your expertise with the group. I'm now going to pass it over to Mike to get us started.
Thanks, Stephanie. Appreciate the introduction and certainly excited to be presenting today, especially with Paul Henderson from Hayes MD Audit, a valued client of Wolf & Company. And, you know, whenever we do these types of presentations, especially around certification audit, I think it always adds value to have a client on with us to kind of give, you know, from both sides of the fence. And certainly I know the best presentations or webinars that I intend are the ones where the curtain is lifted a little bit and you kind of can see how the sausage is made, kind of where missteps happened. So certainly we're going to kind of present from both perspectives. I'll be the main driver of the presentation and start off with a background of HITRUST. Paul will enter in and kind of give you the debrief of lessons learned from on the client side. And then I'll continue to talk about from a HITRUST assessor side, you know, what we see as some of the areas that people are falling down on or are causing trouble for folks overall. So Wolf & Company, we're super old. Is the quickest way to say it. We've been around for quite some time. We have offices throughout the Northeast, but a good many of our service lines project nationally, and certainly our healthcare group operates throughout the country. One thing this slide doesn't capture is the number of health technology companies that we work with. So business associates, and I know we have 44 here, but when you expand it out, we're dealing with probably about 100 or so health tech companies that have been investigating HITRUST and certainly HIPAA security risk analysis work, SOC 2 work, PCI. But certainly we are all about HITRUST today. So here we are. And we'll get going. So what are we going to talk about? You know, I'd like the thing about HITRUST is you really need to buy in and understand, and knowing from its inception and certainly understanding the framework even before you go into a readiness review is important. So having those discussions of why HITRUST. Certainly we'll go over the HITRUST CSF overview. You'll get the lessons learned from Paul from Hayes MD Audit, and then you'll kind of get the lessons learned from my side of the house as a high trust assessor. What are those problem areas and common gaps that we see? We'll give you some high trust resources and certainly some key takeaways. As a thank you for joining the webinar, um, w- what I'd like to offer folks on the call, if it's of interest to you, certainly we're going to be more generic in this presentation, but if you'd like to set up an hour workshop with myself and other members of the High Trust team, we'd be more than happy to do a workshop with you and kind of go over some real kind of granular and personalized things specific to your environment. So please take us up on it. My email is at the end of the presentation. Certainly feel free to reach out. We also have a really good cache of sample policies, templates, and I'm happy to make any of those available to anyone on the webinar. So why high trust? I'll start off by saying high trust, which used to be called the Health Information Trust Alliance, now they like to be referred to by the acronym high trust. And the reason is actually some folks outside of healthcare are using high trust as their framework. So high trust is becoming a little more vertical agnostic, but certainly its main thrust is within the healthcare industry. It was really born about 10 years ago when some of the major players in the healthcare market, Anthem Blue Cross, McKesson, believe the Cleveland Clinic, and a lot of heavy hitters kind of wanted to address the fact that there is no such thing as a HIPAA certification audit. Um, some folks say that they are HIPAA certified. They're being a little disingenuous at best when they say that. Typically when Wolf and Company is going in to do a HIPAA security risk analysis, it's really a gap assessment, right? It's us working with either a provider, health insurer, medical device manufacturer, or health tech company on identifying areas where you're falling short from the HIPAA security or privacy rule and giving recommendations. It's not an opinion. It's not Wolf and Company saying that as of this day, we are certifying that you are in fact HIPAA certified. So kind of, the healthcare industry really wanted to get a certifiable framework, and that's really where High Trust was born. And we've seen consistent growth year over year of the framework. And now, I mean, just some inside baseball. It's one of Wolf's fastest growing service lines, especially in healthcare. Certainly working with healthcare clients in the past before High Trust, you're trying to cobble or get a square peg in a round hole, even though the NIST cybersecurity framework or ISO 27001 are solid frameworks, they really don't speak to the nuances and kind of special circumstances around healthcare. So that's why the high trust CSF is, I think, such a good framework for both providers and for health technology companies. Certainly, we all know, especially even with the pandemic, we've seen an uptick in security attacks and threats. Um, a framework like High Trust is really going to touch all those IT general controls and areas that you really want to be focusing on, not just for certification, but to improve your overall security posture. Um, High Trust does a very good job. It really spans the gamut of threats and controls to look at. It's definitely the most granular and most prescriptive framework that Wolf and Company audits against. Um, but again, it's tailored to healthcare, and really that's the appeal. Um, you know, I, I will say many of you know the Office of Civil Rights, the OCR. They've been very punitive recently in the healthcare space with providers and business associates of really dinging folks for non-HIPAA compliance. If there's a breach over 500, you need to alert the OCR. They're going to open an investigation Typically, they're going to go back 6 years looking at previous risk assessments. Um, and although the OCR would never endorse high trust, they would never force a provider to pick a framework. I've certainly been in the audience and have heard OCR investigators certainly mention that, when they're at a institution that has chosen high trust, they find it a much easier process when they're trying to get information. So I will say that. One of the biggest values of high trust is really how it can enhance your vendor management program. Many of our hospital clients have chosen high trust, not necessarily for certification, but to really pick it as the overarching framework. And now they're asking their business associates um, to to show certification around high trust, or at least to commit to a runway where, whether it's 18 months, 24 months, where they can get to certification. Um, you know, it's really talking the same language. And I say that's one of the biggest benefits of high trust. When someone says they're HIPAA certified, or, they've done work around HIPAA, or have had an independent audit, it's really hard to determine what they used as their benchmark for the controls that they were testing. Were they using NIST? Were they using ISO? Were they using another framework? Like FedRAMP or PCI. So now, if everyone's using high trust, it really it lends to better communication, streamlined communication, more efficiency in that back and forth with vendors. Because if you both have familiarity with high trust, you know how tough it is, to show compliance. So certainly, Wolf and Company, especially my personal view, that it's really a really good framework to use as your overarching framework, and now you're making risk-based decisions based on how you're scoring against certain domains. um, we've seen it reduce overall operational risk. I mean, that's the common thing we see time and time again, when, because it's risk based, it's really affording you the opportunity to looking at all areas of risk and now making good budget decisions on how to mitigate that risk. And certainly with high trust, and we'll get into the scoring of it, but you have a better visual component with high trust because it is a scoring system. So you can see in domain 14 that we've gone from a 2 plus to a 3 minus year over year. And you can start to report to the board on how you're improving. Um, Certainly, I mentioned the high trust CSF is very prescriptive. And that's where, some people will trip up on. Um, Especially folks that haven't undergone an official audit like a SOC 2 audit, or even a really granular HIPAA security risk analysis. It can get a little overwhelming when you see the number of controls in scope. To give people a little perspective, when Wolf and Company does a SOC 2 audit, there's typically between 70 and 90 controls in scope. When we do a high trust audit, there's typically between 350 and 500 controls in scope. So just by stating that, you can see the increased level of effort to show compliance around high trust. Something we'll hit on multiple times is really the policy and procedural statement requirements. Um, they're very robust in high trust. So your typical HIPAA policy set will not be in compliance with high trust. The granularity of the policy statements, and especially the written procedural statements that are needed from a high trust perspective, it's a really important security control, especially around um, especially when we see the turnover that we see in healthcare. So, from a high trust perspective, they want to see that a new hire can come in, look at the policy set, look at the procedural set, and know exactly how that control is implemented and how to show operating effectiveness of that control over a period of time. The scoring system is going to help in that effort, where it's really giving you that clear path on the remediation side. So if you do a full facilitated readiness review, you're going to have a very clear picture of the work that's needed to go from that to certification. So just kind of a high trust overview, and I apologize. I know most folks here are probably at different levels. You know, you're just trying to understand high trust. Some folks may be further down the path. Um, but one of the advantages of high trust is that they took the point of view that there's a lot of good standards out there. So let's take the best from each. So if you look at the high trust CSF, you certainly will see the HIPAA security rule. You'll see HIPAA privacy elements, elements from the High Tech Act, NIST 853, which is NIST's, the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, overarching framework. They've incorporated the NIST CSF now. There are controls from the PCI DSS, and this is really a living and breathing list because HITRUST does quite a few updates. At least once a year, they're looking at, what are some other controls that we can add to the framework to make it a stronger overall framework. Um, just recently, I know they added the Center of Internet Security, critical security controls, at least some aspects from them into the framework. And we'll see some changes from the current version of the CSF, which is 9.4 to 10.0, which I know High Trust is targeting the end of April. I think it might drift out to May. But certainly, it incorporates some of the state laws as well. Folks in Massachusetts know Mass 201 CMR 17, Texas, California, Virginia just put a fairly robust privacy law into effect. So High Trust is continually monitoring those state laws and other frameworks to really enhance and improve the framework on a consistent basis. So there's sometimes a misconception. I'll be asked sometimes by prospects or clients, hey, we want level 1 certification, or we want level 2 or 3 certification. There really is no such thing. There's a fairly detailed and granular high trust questionnaire that Wolf provides to folks, and there's different risk factors. So your organizational risk factor, how many records, how many terabytes of information, system risk factors. Is it one system in scope? Are there 5 systems in scope? And then looking at those the in-scope infrastructure that touches the high trust environment. So mobile devices, certainly if it's accessible from the internet, it's going to increase your overall risk factors. And that's why a lot of times during the readiness review, we'll work with clients on really trying to, one, make sure that the scope is only what folks are asking for, especially if you're a health tech company. What are your clients asking to be included in the high trust certification? High trust does not certify entities or an organization. So an organization doesn't become high trust certified. The certification is really going to be tied to an implemented system or a platform. So if you're a SaaS provider, it's going to be tied to that platform. If you're a provider, it's going to be tied to the number of applications that you're scoping in. So if you're an Epic shop, maybe you're scoping in your instance of Epic. Maybe you're going to scope in all scripts or a few other key ones. But we'll get into that. Starting smaller is always better. So once those risk factors are determined, that's really going to be the determining factor of these, whether you're just going to have to audit against the base level requirement or our level 2 and 3 controls going to come into scope. So it is a scoring system. Um, so when Wolf and Company goes in to do either a readiness review or a validated assessment, we're scoring the control against the high trust rubric. And it's broken out by policy, process, implementation, measured and managed. Now, I will say policy, process, and implemented are going to be the keys. And if you can show 100% compliance with those three elements, you can get certified. We're working with more and more, a lot of assessors, and this is some inside baseball, stayed away from measured and managed controls because they're harder to have evidence for. There's a little more of a cost of compliance to have measured and managed controls. But at Wolf and Company, we certainly look at measured and managed because we want to give folks credit for what they're already doing. And certainly, the more you look at, the more failing one control is going to could sabotage the whole effort. So policy, do you have a policy in place, and is it in compliance with the areas that high trust is concerned about? Does it have will or shall statements in it? Does it actually have the control requirements from high trust documented in the policy? Process really means written procedural statements. So in the past or at the very outset of high trust, you could have some non-written procedures in scope. High Trust has moved away from that and is really keying on having those granular written procedural statements. Um, Implementation. Do you have the control is it in place? Obviously, you see the weight of 40%, having the control, obviously common sense is the most important. um, Now, this is where it gets a little in the weeds. So it's a 5-point scoring system. So the flexibility within high trust is you don't have to score a 5 on every control or every domain. Each domain has to score a 3 or higher. Now it's a plus minus system. So if you looked at the full weight, it's 1 minus 1, 1 plus, 2 minus 2, 2 plus. So if you score a flat 3 on a domain, that's good enough for certification. But if it's a flat 3, you would have to write a corrective action plan. And that's really a mechanism to show how are you going to improve that control year over year. So when we come in to do what's referred to as the interim assessment, folks probably know that high trust is a 2-year certification. So you do the full validated audit year 1. Year 2 would be referred to as the interim assessment, where your assessor will be looking at seeing how you've addressed those corrective action plans and has the any significant changes in the environment happened. So if you score a 3, you can get certified, you need a corrective action plan. So optimally, we like to see scores 3 plus or higher because you get certification without the need of writing a cap. But in general, if you looked at a cross section of our clients, clients certainly have, most of our clients will have 3s in certain areas and then be scoring 3 plus on a majority of the domains. So that's a kind of a quick, just kind of overview of what I wanted to impart of the general process. And now we're gonna hand it off to Hayes MD Audits, Paul Henderson, who I worked with very closely, and I'm very appreciative that he's joined us on the call to give the audience folks kind of that behind the curtain look from a client side, kind of what were the key issues or how HITRUST came into scope, and ultimately, how did the process go? So with that, Paul, I'll hand it off.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Hi, everybody. So like Michael said, my name is Paul Henderson. I'm a lead solutions architect at Hayes MD Audit. A little bit of background on Hayes before we jump into the HITRUST specific project. I've been with Hayes for about 15 years. And in that time, I've seen the company undergo a pretty dramatic shift. So Hayes was founded in 1993, and they specialized in providing consulting services for healthcare organizations. Those services ranged from staff augmentation to strategic planning and leadership activities. In 2016, Hayes decided to focus its resources strictly on its software services, specifically the MD Audit platform. MD Audit is in use by over 126 national and regional healthcare providers, including some of the largest academic medical centers, hospitals, and physician networks in the country. But today I'll be specifically talking about the MD Audit Enterprise software as a service platform, which enables healthcare compliance and revenue integrity capabilities. You can go back one, Mike. So specifically about MD Audit Enterprise, there's three main areas of focus for the platform. There's billing compliance, HIM coding, and revenue integrity. Each area attempts to solve a specific business problem, one or more specific business problems. So for billing compliance, MD Audit Enterprise can identify areas of risk and mitigate those risks, specifically gauging provider risks, and then turning around and educating those providers to reduce the risks which were found. It can also create benchmarks for facilities and other entities, which can then be turned around and used for comparative reporting. And it can increase auditor efficiency by automating that auditing compliance workflow. In the HIM coding space, MD Audit Enterprise can help to identify and mitigate coding errors. It can assess coder productivity, quality, and risks, and enable coding compliance and communication between the compliance departments and the coders themselves. And then on the revenue integrity side, MD Audit Enterprise can help to identify root causes for denials and help to predict trends to reduce the chance of future denials. It can avoid denials and reduce the AR cycle, thus kind of shortening the time it takes to be able to recognize that revenue. And it can ensure long-term optimal reimbursement rates. Okay, Mike, now you can go down to the next one. So a short history of why Hayes decided to undergo the HITRUST assessment. So MD Audit Enterprise is, like I said, a SaaS application where we are stewards of our customers' data. So we needed a way that we could instill trust in our customers and ensure to them that their data will be safe with us. So in 2018, towards the end of 2018, we had successfully completed a SOC 2 audit, but many of our prospects and customers were looking for more evidence into how we would be safeguarding their data. So in addition to us supplying the SOC 2 audit, what else can you guys do on top of that to ensure that our data is going to be safe with you? And we had one customer specifically, which kind of what Mike alluded to earlier, that was actually mandating to their vendors that they start the process of a HITRUST audit. So that kind of right on the tail end of our SOC 2 began our HITRUST journey. So that journey really consisted of four main components. First was our assessor selection process. And that started with Hayes MD Audit internally aligning on what our success criteria would be for ultimately the assessor which we decided to go with for this. So there were several factors that went into that success criteria. There was the assessor's experience doing HITRUST audits and doing compliance audits in general. There was the level of collaboration and communication that we had with them. So did we feel comfortable talking with them and communicating with them? And then obviously there was price that went along with it. So we met with several firms, and using the selection criteria that we defined, we ultimately decided on Wolf. The next step in that process was the baseline assessment. Mike talked about this process a little bit, but it started with us meeting with Wolf over several days and identifying what systems were going to be in scope for the HITRUST assessment. And this was especially important for us because we wanted to make sure that it was strictly scoped to our MD Audit Enterprise platform and not the entire Hayes organization or other basically iterations of MD Audit. So we still had some MD Audit server-based applications, which were still out there, but we wanted to make sure that it was the MD Audit software as a service platform that was going to be undergoing within a scope for the HITRUST assessment. Next step in the baseline assessment was that Wolf did a gap assessment. So they looked at our policies and procedures, and they helped us create remediation plans for those gaps. And then finally, they performed a comprehensive review of all the domains and controls within HITRUST with us. Next step was the validated audit. So Wolf discussed any changes to our in-scope systems since the baseline assessment was performed. And there were a few, right? So our SaaS application is constantly evolving. So the time period between when the baseline was performed and when the validated audit needed to occur, we needed to rationalize those changes in the evolution in that platform with them. Wolf also reviewed our responses to the in-scope controls and provided really valuable feedback in situations where we either overscored in our self-assessment or underscored in several situations as well. Next, they executed their field work. So they performed interviews with key stakeholders, reviewed our policies and procedures, and gathered evidence. And that occurred over the span of, I want to say, several days to a couple of weeks. And then as a last step before submission, Wolf helped us with some remediation activities that we needed to carry out. The next step was to actually do the HITRUST submission. And before that, Wolf did perform one last final review with us before submitting the final assessment. And once that was done, it was kind of out of Hayes MD Audit's hands, and it was up to Wolf and HITRUST to work together on the final report. Our experience with Wolf has really been fantastic, to say the least. We like to think of our relationship with them and the experience we've had with Wolf is centering around three main points. The first is that we've had direct access to an engagement team with Wolf. And what's been really important about that engagement team has been the consistency with who has been represented on that team. So as much consistency as there has been with Wolf, we've had the same team assigned to us throughout this entire process. So that's been a key point for us and something that we haven't experienced in previous compliance audits. And without that, you're always kind of starting from scratch and teaching someone else what your system is and what your policies and procedures mean. But having that consistency means that you don't have to waste that on-ramp time of talking and walking through a new resource on what you're actually trying to accomplish. That engagement team has had open lines of communication with us. So we are always comfortable reaching out directly to them, and they're always prompt to reply, whether it's a phone call or an email or to jump on a quick Zoom session. Wolf was also pre-pandemic very open to coming into on-site visits. So that was always a big factor in our initial success, is that we were able to have those face-to-face conversations, which can be very efficient and was very helpful as we were getting ramped up in what the HITRUST process was. So obviously, while the on-sites have paused during the pandemic, we have been able to stay connected with our engagement team and with Wolf leadership through virtual meetings, and obviously we hope to resume those on-sites soon. And really overall, it's been an ongoing relationship with Wolf. So we really see our relationship with them as as not just a means to an end. So we weren't viewing it as we're going to have this relationship, we're going to get our HITRUST certification, and then we're going to walk away. It's been an ongoing process, and we've come to view Wolf as a trusted partner in our compliance field. A great example of that is what Mike had alluded to earlier, where HITRUST is undergoing a version revision. So they're adding in some new controls and some new scope to those controls. And Wolf was right on top of that and let us know as soon as they knew about it so that we could prepare for our interim assessment, which we're about to undergo any day now. So some lessons learned. So what did we get out of this? As looking back on the process, there's kind of 5 main things that I'd like to highlight. One is that it's really important for your organization to have a commitment to the HITRUST framework. So Hayes's policies and procedures prior to our HITRUST assessment contained aspects from many security frameworks. There were aspects from SOC, from NIST, from ISO, but having HITRUST incorporate all of the aspects from those various frameworks allowed us to align all of our policies and procedures to the HITRUST framework, thus kind of making it easier to stay on top of evolving security regulations. Another key lesson learned would be to organize your artifacts. Just due to the sheer amount of controls and domains in HITRUST, you can find a way to organize your policies and procedures in such a way that it'll make it simpler to align those controls in HITRUST to those artifacts. It's going to make the process a whole lot easier. So this organization can be done in several ways. We've used tags on artifacts. We've used naming conventions, endnotes, footnotes, anything that will say that this part of this policy or procedure applies to that domain and control in HITRUST. That was a big step forward for us, and I think allowed us to get through the validated assessment with relative ease. The next lesson learned is to dedicate appropriate resources to this project. The process is, it will be simpler if you can dedicate a team, or kind of depending on the scope that you're going to be looking at, just dedicate the appropriate resources to the HITRUST certification process. 4 people giving 50% of their time are probably not going to get the project done as efficiently as 2 people who are dedicating 90 to 100% of their time on this, right? So I would just say that was probably a harder lesson learned, but it's one that we know going forward for sure. The next one is to get to know the MyCSF tool. It's really a great tool once you kind of can get in there and familiarize yourself with it and get used to it. But there is a learning curve to it. And I think understanding how to navigate the tool and what it is will make it, and if you can get that done early in the process, it'll make the validated assessment easier so that you don't have to spend the time just learning the logistics of the tool. You're already comfortable with it. You're comfortable with how to, with working with your assessor on getting the documentation and the artifacts and the evidence into the tool itself. And then the last one is to be mindful of future certifications as you're going through your initial HITRUST audit. So we want to view it as not just trying to get this certification done, but we were mindful of the fact that this was going to be an ongoing process for us, right? We weren't just going to do it this one time and then walk away. So we wanted to know what we needed to continue to do after the certification was complete in order to make the interim assessment and then future validated assessments more smooth than the one that preceded it. So every time you're looking to get more efficient with the overall process. So even though we've successfully completed our initial HITRUST assessment, we're still learning and evolving our compliance program. Understanding that this is something which is going to require constant attention from us, it really helps to set expectations with our leadership for appropriate resourcing. We feel confident that the HITRUST certification is going to be the best way for Hayes MD Audit to demonstrate to our customers and our prospects that their data is going to be safe with us. And we look forward to future engagements with Wolf to continue to guide us through those certifications.
Thanks, Paul.
My pleasure.
That was really good information. So you'll hear a kind of a common theme, and I'll repeat there'll be some repetitiveness between what I'm saying and what Paul's saying, but just to really drive the point home, you have to have organizational buy-in, especially because there could be a cost of compliance. It's not just getting the certification. If you're showing deficiencies in event log management, you may have to go out and spend for a security incident event management system, a SIM, or hire a managed service provider to perform those type of services for you. Certainly the time involved, there's a cost to that. So certainly top-down organizational buy-in is critical. You just can't dip your toe in HITRUST. You really need to dive, make a good decision, have those discussions. Is HITRUST right for us based on either folks asking us for compliance, or do we like the framework as our mechanism to improve our overall security posture? Excuse me. And then the second, it's scoping, and scoping. Where projects go off the rails really quick is when people overscope. One, scoping in too many systems into the scope, going beyond, from a health tech standpoint, going beyond, what your clients and prospects are asking for. From a provider standpoint, again, you really want to start small. Start with your certified EHR, maybe increase it to the overall meaningful use environment, and now you can year over year add in applications to the HITRUST scope. But I mean, even a small community hospital with 150 beds, could have 100 applications that houses PHI. So to scope in 100 applications to your HITRUST audit, it just would be overwhelming, and that project would go off the rails pretty quick. And just preparing for success. So even doing a pre-assessment, understanding before you go out and get the resources of a HITRUST assessor, learning as much as you can about the framework. We've had clients send folks to HITRUST to get HITRUST certified. So, and especially those folks that are going to project manage a future HITRUST engagement. Like Paul said, learning my CSF. So, and I didn't include this in the before Paul spoke, but when you get to the validated assessment, there's a requirement that you have to purchase my CSF, which is HITRUST GRC tool, and the mechanism of how Wolf and Company or any assessor is conducting the audit. We would be uploading documents into my CSF. The actual scoring of the controls happens within my CSF. And the better that our clients know the tool, it's just going to make for a better overall project. And we'll go over some common gaps. So we went over kind of lessons. We went over the organizational buy-in. It depends on the size of your organization. Certainly, we work with 25-person SaaS companies, and we work with large regional providers that have tens of thousands of employees and large business associates, that are Fortune 1000. So it's going to be depending on your size when you talk about, who should lead the project. It could, if you're really mature and you have an internal audit group or a compliance group, having them being the project manager could work. Certainly including people from all business lines, because high trust, especially from an IT perspective, is going to touch everything. So vendor management, HR with onboarding and offboarding controls. It's just going to shine light on every business line in the organization. So including people from all business lines and having a high trust working group really makes a lot of sense. In general, you want as large and as long a runway as possible from the inception of we're choosing high trust to ultimately getting certified. The more time you can bake in, the better. The worst calls we get as an assessor is someone with panic in their voice saying a certain organization won't sign our contract unless we're high trust certified in 90 days. Can you help us? And the answer, we're fairly transparent and honest. The answer would be no. That's not going to be a good audit for anyone. One, from your point, from the client's point of view, it's going to just be impossible to show compliance or to get to certification in anything under a year. You want to bake in doing that pre work where you're understanding it, you're now remediating some issues. And then the way so when Wolf and Company comes in to do a facilitated readiness review, we actually break that out. We'll do a workshop so folks understand how we score, what is 100% compliant policy, what's 100% compliant procedural statement. And then we're kind of giving some homework to our clients saying, okay, to get the best out of this readiness review, go do some remediation. And now when we come back to do the readiness review, we're really going to have an impact and be able to really cite some granular controls for remediation. So scoping, again, it's important. I will say, folks who have seen where scope creep can happen, if I sent you our high trust questionnaire, you would see these regulatory factors. Like, so do you need to be compliant with PCI or all the state regs? Our advice is, except for HIPAA, don't check any of those boxes. Yes, would it be nice to include the PCI controls, the payment card industry controls? Yes, but no one's going to accept a high trust certification as assurance regarding your PCI compliance. They're going to want to see a PCI report on compliance. So don't check those boxes and don't create such a large scope where it's really going to impact the success of the audit. Again, number of records processed per year. We would work with you on how to answer that. One thing people will trip up on is they're counting. They're not just counting unique records. They're counting too much. So that can actually increase the scopes in control. And I've mentioned before, many providers will start with just their core EHR. So I can't say this enough. I would say even over 50% of a high trust audit is going to be a very big paper exercise. So you really need to budget for that uh, properly. And whether that's identifying someone on the staff who's going to be doing that policy work, hiring an outside policy and procedural statement writer. High Trust has virtual chief security officer services, so we'll actually perform that for some clients. So there's multiple ways to address it, but just know that it's going to be needed to be addressed. And we'll hear back that, geez, we really have to get that granular. And the answer is yes. So just so how you know the audit works, Wolf comes in to do the validated assessment, and then we're sending that off via my CSF to HITRUST, who ultimately is giving the certification. So once that happens, now the QC process starts, and that's where Wolf and Company's dealing with the HITRUST Alliance, defending our position. They may come back and say, geez, Wolf, you scored Hayes MD audit 100% on this policy requirement. We see it more as 50%. We don't see the evidence. So now we're there to defend our position, point them to the right documentation that supports our view, and we'll have that back and forth with HITRUST. And I'd like to think we win most of those arguments, but sometimes, HITRUST will come back and say no. We need to reduce this score on this particular control. So we'll have those in-depth discussions. And that preparation for success, and things we've talked about. Um, to Paul's point, having a project manager is critical. If someone calls us up and says, we want to get HITRUST certified, even if they say, we want to go with you, Wolf and Company, and then we start having these discussions, and it's kind of apparent to us that that client wants nothing to do with HITRUST. They just want to get certified. They don't want to touch my CSF. They really don't want to have any skin in the game. We respectfully, we thank that firm for reaching out to us, but we're not going to be the right assessor for them, because we really need to have a true partnership with the organization that we're working with, and having that back and forth. Um, being brutally honest with yourself during that, when you do that first kind of run through. We've come into situations, we typically don't like to do a validated audit unless we've done the readiness review. Um, that's not always the case, but we'll ask for that client's readiness review, and too often we get those back and we just see hundreds across the board. They're scoring 4s and 5s across all 19 domains. And although maybe someday I'll walk into an organization that actually is scoring 4s or 5s, but typically, and it's not through trying to get to be disingenuous, but folks that aren't accustomed to the type of evidence that's required to show compliance, especially for these certification audits, really struggle with. They'll say, oh yeah, we do that, but they don't realize that they don't have a written policy or procedural for it. Or the other issue is, now there are point in time controls with HITRUST, but there are also controls that we need to come in as an assessor and actually sample over a period of time. So we'll send clients we'll ask for populations of servers, whether they're in-house or in the cloud. We'll ask for populations of new hires. And now Wolf and Company, as the assessor, is statistically sampling those, and we're sending those samples back saying, okay, show us the evidence for this. Because not only do we want to see the control in place, we want to see that specific control was operating in effective at a minimum over 3 months. So if you're going to do your own self-assessment or pre-self-assessment, I really urge you to be brutally honest and try to accurately score yourself. Um, I know we're getting to the end of it, and I want to leave at least a few minutes for questions. Um, any certification audit, it's around access control. Can you show it? Can you show that it's being monitored? And can you show that both your onboarding procedures and offboarding procedures are really on point? We see folks fall down on the vendor management side. They're not set. It's not enough just to have a BAA signed. You really need to show that you have a fully operational vendor management program where you're sending out questionnaires, you're reviewing SOC 2 reports, you're reviewing those organizations' high trust reports. Incident response planning is an area where folks aren't 100% compliant. We want to see specific IR playbooks around ransomware, DDoS attacks. And the same goes for disaster recovery business continuity planning. We want to see that a business impact analysis was performed where you're looking at recovery point objectives, recovery time objectives, and that you have a really good sense of your infrastructure and what would happen if there was an outage. When can those systems be back up and running? And again, I'll end with the policy and procedural statements. It's really critical to get those right. And with that, Stephanie, I'll throw it back to you. I'll end with just repeating my offer. If folks want to grab, more of my time and members of my team's time, we're happy to schedule an hour kind of workshop where we can kind of go over my CSF scoping, even pricing in more depth. So, the other offer is, I'm happy to. I have a lot of examples of policy and procedural statements. So please feel free to use us as a resource. And we really, I personally thank you for the time today, and I'm sure Paul does as well. So thank you very much. And back to you, Stephanie. Stephanie, you're muted if you don't see that.
Mike, so it looks like we did get some questions come in.
Okay.
So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Sorry for that delay. The first question that we received is the certification process different for a hospital versus a health tech company?
It is in a number of different ways. One, a provider or health system or a covered entity would never, so I shouldn't say never. We do have some provider clients that have a direct special relationship. They're working with a special project with Anthem Blue Cross or Aetna or Humana, United, and now they're saving claims data on a certain segment of the network. In those instances, those health insurers may ask the provider for that segment of the network to be HITRUST certified. But in general, no one's really going to be asking a provider to show certification. So because of that, and because of the size of a hospital and the size of the network, scoping becomes a critical factor. And that's where I really suggest to providers to choose HITRUST as the framework. And now you're looking at a 1, 3, 5 year roadmap of how you're going to get to perhaps 100% compliance, and you may want to get certified. But typically, most providers are choosing it as a framework. They're doing they're doing a HITRUST audit, but they're saying, okay, we're okay with our domains being under 3 for these domains. We accept that risk at the moment, and we're going to methodically try to remediate those to eventually get to certification. Where on the health tech side, it's usually the HITRUST certification is usually driven through contractual obligations, where one of your clients or prospects are asking you, if you want to do business with me, please show that you've committed down the path of HITRUST.
Thanks, Mike. Looks like we're right at 1 o'clock. So I know there were a few questions that were sent in. We're happy to follow up with you directly for those who did send them in directly. If you did send them in anonymously, you will be receiving this PowerPoint slide deck, and you can reach out to the presenters directly with those questions. And that concludes our HITRUST certification webinar. And just a reminder, you will be receiving a follow-up email, like I said, that has the link to the recording to rewatch or pass along to a colleague, as well as the presentation. So on behalf of Wolf, I want to thank Paul for joining us today and bringing his expertise, and also Mike for joining us on this topic. And if you do have any questions after the conclusion of this webinar that you weren't able to ask, please feel free to reach out to them directly and they'll be happy to follow up with you. So I hope everyone has a great rest of their day, and we hope to see you again soon on another webinar.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.